Thanks everyone for attending. Today, we're going to be led by Frank, who is going to give us a little bit of an introduction to a recent project that he worked on that we thought could springboard into a larger discussion, possibly of how to integrate interactive JavaScript elements and widgets onto a Drupal site. So Frank is going to start off by giving an overview of the specific project and what went into it, and then we can have a little bit of a discussion about the parts that have to get assembled in the right way to make that work. And anyone who's had similar experiences can then chime in with their own as well. So I will hand it over to Frank.
All righty. Well, thanks all for coming. So a little bit of background on the project. We have a client called Weta, and they have a website called Brainline, where basically they talk about brain injury, PTSD, and solutions that people who are suffering from those injuries can take. And one part of the site that they really liked was what they called the interactive brain, where it was basically a Flash-based solution where there was a 3D image of a brain where people could click on it to get more information on the different lobes of the brain, including both internal and external. And as most of you may or may not know, Flash Player got end of life January 1st of this year, good riddance. But that did create a problem for this client because their nice little interactive solution was going away. So we put in place a little bit of a stopgap. I'll share that with you now, courtesy of Wayback Machine. And it was basically just a little slideshow with some of the pieces of the brain and images that people could page through, getting a little bit of that extra information. But it was nowhere near as rich as the solution that they had in place before. And I wish I could show that to you, but once again, Flash is dead and Chrome wants it to stay that way. So this is basically what we were stuck with. So we decided to go back in before Flash got end of lifed and create a new interactive brain for them. And this is what we ended up coming up with. So as before, we could hover over different pieces of the brain, zip on over to them, get their little bits of information, and then swap over to an internal view where they could see all of the internal pieces as well. And then we can also use the slideshow controls as well to pick through the different pieces of the brain as well. So first, I'm going to go through the requirements of the project. I've kind of touched on a couple of them already. And then we're going to go into all the pieces that we needed to put together to make this happen. And then hopefully from that, we can kind of move into a broader discussion about interactive JavaScript and how we can implement things like this in Drupal. So obviously, requirement number one, got to be interactive. It's got to be more than a slideshow. People need to click around a brain and be able to see the different pieces. Two, we needed to be able to swap between the two different views of the brain, the lateral and the medial view. Third, we needed to show information about the selected portion of the brain. And four, it also, to the extent that we could make it something like this accessible. So we decided to offload the heavy lifting to a couple of JavaScript libraries. So one of them, and that's the one that we use to generate the actual image of the brain itself, is called jQuery VMap. I don't know if any of you have heard of that before, but basically it's usually meant for interactive mapping solutions. So companies can create, hey, here's a map of the US and here are sales reps in each of the states or something like that. It comes preloaded with maps of the United States and the world, but we obviously don't want the US, we want a brain. Luckily, it also gives the ability to use custom maps via SVG images that you can put in. So that is the route that we ended up going with. The other piece that we used was Slick Slider, which is a semi-accessible slider function, which we have implemented in Drupal here via paragraphs and an attached Slick library. So this information, the slider, was already in Drupal. We just repurposed what was already there with the stopgap. And then we combined that together with the JQV map using a custom module to bring it all together. So that gets us to the different pieces that we used here. So the first thing that we did was we created a small custom module to output the markup that we needed, the containers for each of these pieces. And then as well, using the libraries file in the module to attach the JS libraries that we needed. So in this case, the jQuery vmap. Slick was already in the system because we were already using it on the site. But that, if you were implementing this from scratch, could have also been put inside of the module. And so I'll just show you a quick look of what that looks like here. So we got a JS folder here within our brain module, where we have our library JavaScript file. We have our brain module, where we have our container put on our page here, being inserted as a block, and then a function that actually renders the brain itself, where we are attaching our JavaScript library, the JQV map, and then our brain JavaScript file as well. And then the CSS that is necessary to output the styles that we need. And then, of course, the markup for the actual brain containers themselves, as well as these two buttons that we use to swap between the views. So that's our basic markup, and that's how we got it on the page. And then, of course, the block itself is placed within the block administrative backend in Drupal. Then we have the other piece of the secret sauce here, and this is largely compliments of Haley, who is here in the call with us, who traced out an image of the brain that was provided to us by the client and created our SVG paths that we put into this map.json file. So this is where all of the information about the brain itself is stored, and this is what we are accessing to actually plug into the jQuery vmap and create this image here. So that includes the index, and that is the corresponding slide number in the slider here. So we can associate each of these lobes with a corresponding slide. Then we also have the actual name of the piece itself, and then the SVG path if it indeed has one. Then we pulled it all together into this JS file. Heavy lifting here is courtesy of Jonathan and his mad jQuery skills. But basically what we did was instantiate the vector map and using the built-in configuration options that they give us to color the different pieces of the brain and the outlines between the pieces, as well as our hover and active colors and styles. But we need to access all of this data somehow. So we're getting our JSON here and wrapping it all in a Drupal behavior with the context of our wrapper element that we created in our module. So this is only getting injected onto this page, so we're not calling all of this extra JavaScript on every single page that we load on the site. So that keeps it a bit more performant. Then we go through basically a bunch of different pieces of functionality, allowing us to swap back and forth between the medial and the lateral views, and to keep the slides and the views synced up as well, so that we're not just bouncing around within a lateral view while the slider is on a medial view, et cetera, et cetera. And that's, for the large part, the basics of how we implemented this piece of the project. Jonathan, I don't know if you had any other particular insights as to the implementation here.
Not specifically, so can you recall any particularly difficult aspects to this transition?
I think, at least for me, where I'm at in my career right now, the getting all of the bits and pieces working together, especially these two libraries here, the slider and JQVmap, so that they were synced up together was, I think, the most difficult part of implementation, at least from my end. Actually adding and putting all the libraries that we needed into the place that we needed it to be was actually not that difficult. It was, once we got the data there, how do we manipulate it in the way that we want, in a way that is accessible to our users and not confusing them?
Yeah, so in this case, the data gets to JavaScript, I guess, mostly through the HTML that is produced on the page. That do we have data attributes in the HTML to support these?
Yes. Yeah, we have the maps for the data attributes on the different views of the brain, which is how we swap between them. So we use jQuery to target those data attributes when slides are being changed or when a specific region of the brain is clicked on. So it knows, hey, okay, this lobe is associated with this region, and this slide is associated with this region as well.
So then the other, so that's one way of getting content to jQuery, is just putting stuff in the DOM that it can see. And then the other bit would be using providing script data in Drupal using the attached. And I don't think we have any of that here. Right now you're attaching a library, which is a static JS file. Can we look at the JS files again?
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
So in this case, yeah, you're attaching, and of course this is Drupal 7, so the syntax will be a little different today for new sites, but the principle still applies. So so if you look at brain.js, then we have information about how to attach all these behaviors, but then do we actually have the data in this file for all of the regions?
No, we have this map.json file.
Map.json, right?
Where all of the info about the individual regions themselves are, and
that is loaded by JavaScript
here. These are, so this is a bit of stuff how JQVmap works. They use 2-letter keys, usually, states is normally what they are used. So MI, IL, CA, etc. So we had to do the exact same thing here for JQVmap to actually understand the information that we're giving it.
Right. So this is data that we're providing to the script. And in this case, is this I'm trying to remember, is this an Ajax call that pulls this in from brain.js? Pulls in
so
map.json?
We get JSON function.
Exactly.
That
Okay.
pulls it in. Yep.
So we did that as an expedient way of getting that data in place, because we determined that this was a one-off and we weren't going to be managing that content inside Drupal. The different regions there aren't actually any fields that hold that information. But sometimes you'll want that part to be dynamic, in which case you wouldn't have a JSON file like that. You'd need to provide it in a different way. So you could either have that something like that JSON file that is dynamically generated, maybe through a view or something like that, or you could use the settings feature when you're putting a script on an element, where you can basically take PHP values and turn them into JavaScript values for your use later. So we didn't have to do either of those here. I am woefully unprepared, so I don't have an answer at my fingertips for an example of that. But I know that we adapted this from the solution on the Special Olympics site, which did use something dynamic to generate that. Let me see if I can pull that up easily. This is me stalling for time while I try to type things in. While I'm pulling up that example, any other questions for Frank? Okay, so I am going to share my screen for a moment, and then I'll pass it back. So did that work? I'm not sure.
I see your VS Code.
Okay, good.
Yep.
All right. So in this case, we have the interactive map on this site uses that same library, but we're producing all that data that you were seeing with PHP. And this is doing some queries. This is well, it's a views area, but it's effectively like a page controller that is taking all of the regions for the map in turn, producing this array. And then when we produce the render array, you see we're attaching the library, which is the Drupal 8 equivalent to what Frank was showing for the attached things. But then we're also using this Drupal settings feature to pass along these PHP arrays, which then become JavaScript arrays that JavaScript can then get to by looking at Drupal settings. So Drupal settings.someuserlocation.colors comes from Drupal settings, someuserlocation colors. So you'll see the JavaScript syntax here, or the PHP syntax here and the JavaScript syntax there. And it basically bridges that for you. So that's another primary technique that we can use. So
I had a couple questions. If you're
go for it, Dan.
In a question time. So it looked like from what code I saw flash by that you took those libraries and kind of put them in your module as opposed to them being installed libraries. Is that correct? And was there like a specific reason why you did it that way versus like manage them as libraries with Composer?
If you're talking about the Drupal 7 example that Frank showed, it's
well,
because
that
there's no Composer there.
Okay, enough said on that one.
Yeah, and the Drupal 8 one, if we were doing it today, I probably would push for that, although this particular library isn't one that's maintained in a like NPM or something like that, which makes things harder. So basically we would have had to invent our own storage for it's just because this particular library is an oddball.
So I was, as you were describing that at the beginning, I was, one of the DrupalCon sessions was about a module called Component, which purports to be an easy way to manage like adding external libraries to your site like that. And I just wondered if you had any familiarity with that. And
no, that's new to me.
Obviously, is Drupal 8. So it was something very intriguing to me because we've had a couple cases where it would have been nice to be able to easily add, a library, JavaScript library, and take advantage of it. But we kind of aborted the plan because we didn't have the expertise to do, what you just showed us. So without there being an easy way for us to do it, we kind of did it a totally different way.
So is this components thing specific to themes, or does it extend to modules?
I'm just gonna see if is it actually called components? I just have a note that I wrote down. Yeah, so the module is actually called component, although I see it's the release candidate. This is the right one. Yeah, right, that's the one. So just with a YAML file, they showed a demo. I don't, it was 3 weeks ago, so I'm going from my memory. And what they showed was it was pretty simple, just a couple of configuration files, and then all of a sudden this external library is available to your site for use like you're using, but without having to manage the library part of it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't, beyond that, I don't know what exactly it does. It just is something that I made note of because the next time it comes up where it would be nice to have an external JavaScript library to do something like what you're doing, I plan to investigate it, this module. So you don't have any more knowledge about it than I do, so we're in the same boat of
yeah.
First one that does something with it can share at Google.
Yeah, we have recently at Rapid Development, we've recently adopted a new solution that needs some time to become mature, but we're using, well, there's been an established solution. I'll share again here. There's been an established solution called Asset Packageist. That is, so Packageist is the repository that the Composer project itself has for PHP libraries, and Asset Packageist is unaffiliated but inspired by Packageist, and what it does is simply mirror things that you could find on NPM or Bower. So basically, primarily that means JavaScript modules, and make those available through Composer. So that's a solution that really what that requires is that you have this declaration in your repositories, and then you need to do a couple extra things to tell Composer that that NPM and Bower things should go into web libraries and not into vendor. But at that point, then you can just require things from that library. So that's one thing we can do, but we're now taking that a step further with our own package repository. And we have a module that we're starting to curate for things that we have in common across all of our sites. And I don't have it. I chose a project that doesn't have this. Let's see. If I change to this one. Okay. So let's see. Okay, so we have a module now that we're starting to curate that then in its libraries has dependencies on the JavaScript that so in its Composer file, it's then going to have requirements on the common NPM assets that we use, like a modal library, so that we can wrap it up and make it nice once that we can use lots of different places. So that probably is tackling somewhat the same thing that this component idea is going for.
Yeah. I think we've talked about this before, which is, independent of any JavaScript, even regular old PHP modules, being able to install them with Composer as a standard is pretty powerful.
Yeah, the
from a repository.
Yeah, the real struggle has been that you want to declare the dependencies where they on the thing that actually depends on what you're including. So if you've got a custom module that depends on either a PHP module or a JavaScript library or whatever, you want to put the dependency in that module, but Composer doesn't work that way unless that module itself is being installed by Composer. So for your custom code, where you normally would just have it in the project, you have to declare those in your whole site's Composer directory, which is not ideal for organization purposes. But but then the short answer, of course, is this was Drupal 7, so we couldn't do any of this stuff.
So my other question was, one of the very prominent themes at DrupalCon was the elimination of jQuery. And considerable urgency expressed for like eliminating all traces of it, at least in Drupal core and any even initiatives. So as a not especially who's not done a lot of JavaScript development, like jQuery made it like the barriers to entry very low compared to learning a lot of JavaScript. So I was curious that you used jQuery here, but this might have been some time ago, so maybe that doesn't apply. But
yeah, I mean, jQuery is going to be heavily supported for Drupal 7 and 8 sites for forever. It's kind of a future proofing thing, and it's not that jQuery is going to stop being stop working. It's just that you're not it's less necessary now, because
the impression that I had was more that a lot of the things that jQuery was created to do, you can now do pretty easily with native JavaScript, making it unnecessary in terms of making your code easier.
Absolutely. Yeah,
there's tons of jQuery around. So.
Yeah, it basically, the main thing, of course, being just finding something on the page was a nightmare when jQuery was invented, if it didn't already have an ID. And now that is something that's built into every browser. So especially now that if you have a setup that can compile ES6 down into JavaScript, into ES4, then a lot of things are nicer, though that's more architecture that isn't built into Drupal. So we're not quite there yet as in our company. And I imagine a lot of people are in the same boat. So it's going to be around for a while, but it's good to know how to do things a couple different ways, I think.
So one final question. The slider control was a Drupal module that was already like a canned out of the box thing that you can do to create that slider functionality, right? Including the page navigation on the bottom. Did I understand that correctly?
I think it was a Drupal module, but it was a jQuery plugin.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, but you could stick that independently, and you could have the navigation. But now linking the two of them, so that means that was jQuery that they were already attaching to the page. So did you have to then attach or add a listener to that existing event that was already there for those? To make it synchronize with the other side.
Yeah, Frank, maybe you can share that JavaScript page again.
Yes, let me share screen real quick. There we go. All right.
So if you look at, let's see, if we just look at some events in here. So let's see, where's a good one?
So here's a click function down here.
Yep. So there's one whenever you whenever you click on brain
That's on
view
the-
link
on the brain side,
image,
yeah.
yep,
Mhm.
then it's going to hide and show. Let's see where that's not actually doing the switch. Where's one that does? There's one. Okay,
There was,
right at line 50 there. So that says that's a before change event. So that's something that slider widget defines. So every time the slide is going to change, we can react to that and update the map.
yeah, perfect.
And then at line 43, every time a region is selected, that is sending a message back to Slick Slider saying go to a particular slide. So actually, that JQV map is not the most well documented and beautifully architected thing in the world, but Slick Slider is pretty good and defines events like that we were able to hook into and wire it up pretty well. So I don't think we've ended our search for the perfect interactive map utility. It seems like something that should be a little bit more standardized these days because it's very useful. All right.
I mean, kind of to that end, has anybody else here implemented something like a map, interactive map before? And if so, what did you use for that?
Yeah. I'm curious about that answer too.
That's a no from me.
I wonder if some of the implementations now are becoming more framework specific, like React or something of that nature, because certainly there are some options there, but that's not going to be cross framework. That's going to be specific to an implementation. So yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know, Dan, did they talk about what if there would be another framework that would be used heavily by Drupal, or if it would mainly
For
just be,
decoupled front end stuff, you mean?
yeah.
No, I think there's buzz around that, but I don't think there's, from what I gathered, there wasn't any, you know, as you probably know, they've been like really, really hesitant to sort of pick a winner out of all the options. So far it's been mainly React. It's gotten the focus, but there was buzz about some different things that they might do, but nothing really tangible as far as directions they were going that I heard. I would say, you know, I've never done anything like this, but we did have a need on a site to do some tweaking of the full calendar module, which is a full calendar library, really, implementation. And it is, some of that looked very similar because we ended up not doing what we were originally trying to figure out how to do, but we did get to the point where, like in theme preprocess functions, they're doing some of that PHP settings stuff and kind of passing off to the library, you know, arrays of information that it uses when it renders. So that's apparently a fairly, well, not fairly, I should say. At least that's kind of the way they did it too. So as you said, Jonathan, that's, you know, one of the two ways you can do it that people use.
Yeah, and actually, we on that same site that Frank is showing, there's a regular US map, and it. So this is, I'll share this one too. This is a map where you can go to any one of these items, and the fancy script that's running here is that there isn't one. It's just an SVG with paths that have anchors on them.
Interesting.
So in this case, there's just there's just no script functionality because we didn't need this to be dynamic in
Yeah.
any way.
Yeah.
So never the same solution twice.
Looking at the DrupalCon docs here, it looks like Drupal 9 is going to be trying to deprecate jQuery, and Drupal 10 won't have any support.
Right.
Sounds like.
And won't have any support
Which is-
would mean that it's just not built in. Not
Yeah,
that you
it's
couldn't
not in
include it.
core. So
Right.
Yep, it won't. Yep, it won't be included exactly.
So
they
so
can't
none
really
of
break your site that uses it,
right. Yeah.
or your module that uses it.
Yeah, I think the biggest concern probably is just performance, because now that we don't need a lot of the shortcuts that jQuery gives us, we can then, if we can do the same thing without the overhead, that's a win.
Yeah, the impression I got was the overhead of the performance itself, but also the overhead just of the maintenance of it. So it's an additional dependency that you have to have, and reliance on the maintenance of it, and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it'll be interesting to also look at just what the Symphony project is doing with regard to JavaScript support, because that's probably not as clearly a direction that they'll.
Yeah,
Yes.
that is interesting. I mean, they're going in some different. They're kind of dabbling in a number of different areas. I don't know if Symphony itself is advocating for one or another, but they have something like they call stimulus, which is a way to have. It's basically a much more refined and modern way of doing what Drupal tries to do with the form API, Ajax type stuff. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Frank, for presenting about this project. Very interesting. And we've got a little bit more time. I am interested in hearing a little bit more of just the overall experience, Dan, that you had with the virtual DrupalCon, how that played out, how much of your day was consumed by that.
Well, it was DrupalCon North America, so as opposed to GlobalCon or whatever they call it. So it
Right.
was really kind of oriented towards Western Hemisphere time zones at least. So like the sessions officially went from like 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. or 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. or so. And, you know, it's kind of the case that you would like to believe that you could get some work done while you're listening to this thing, but, you know, then you're either not paying attention to what they're saying and miss something, or you're not really doing very effective work. So we pretty much just kind of carved out that we weren't going to really do much during that, you know, time period of the day.
Yeah.
But I would say, like, overall, we attended last year's too, which was also virtual, and this year's I'd actually, if any of you went to it, I'd be interested in your opinion, because we all felt like this year's was what they tried to make a lot of these like 10-minute lightning sessions. And what happened is by the time the person introduced themselves, 4 minutes were gone. And then they're trying to, you know, give you this overview on some really complex, really important topic, you know, in 5 minutes, because they want to leave time at the end to close. So that part of it was really pretty ineffective, we thought, and certainly that would be, you know, what I would say. Whereas last year it was more of kind of a traditional, you know, technical conference where there's hour-long sessions where they can kind of really dive into it and do a lot of demos and, you know, on-screen examples and that kind of thing, and take questions. So it also left no time really at all for questions. So it was really kind of ineffective, I thought.
My experiences have, I didn't attend this one. My experiences have been with the smaller, like the Drupal camp size, and those have, by virtue of smaller attendance, can handle questions a little better. I imagine. Which software were they using for DrupalCon this time?
they use the same thing they used last year. It was, what is it? Man, I forget what the platform is, but it also has some weaknesses. Man, I'm drawing a complete blank.
Yeah,
I can't remember.
it feels like we should be a little bit better at this a year in, but it's still
Well,
a struggle.
and the resources of Drupal, the Drupal organization itself, like that was pretty disappointing. Like you're hosting a virtual conference and there's no way to see a schedule. Like there's no place you can go to see the schedule of the sessions. So like some pretty glaring like holes of using this platform that exists to host conferences. Like it was kind of puzzling. But we just kind of figured, like, as is often the case when we go looking for third-party solutions, like none of them are perfect, so you kind of have to pick the one that's the best and then work around the couple of major flaws that it has. So it's probably what they had to do too.
Yeah.
But last year's I think was just better. But I think the takeaway or like the value is, even with the better format last year, the takeaway and value really is more like introduction to some things like this component module, like just some ideas of something you might want to consider in the future, and would take further deep dive exploration anyway. So I think that was why they thought the 10-minute thing would work, because it's really just kind of an introduction that, hey, this thing exists and this is generally what it does, just so the next time you might need something like that. But it was really too short. 20 minutes might have worked, but 10 minutes it was just too short.
Yeah.
But that's always my takeaway, for conferences in general. It's just kind of the value is more in the introduction to new things than it is getting deep dives into things.
And in the in-person iterations, usually the real value is you attend some talk like that, and the person next to you that you've never met before is also interested in that, and then you talk about it in the hallway for a while, and that's going to be absent.
Yeah, and like as an example, the guy who has written and maintained the web form module was doing a presentation on web form, and so they did have what they called virtual hallways. So they had some rooms set up where you could go do that virtually. And a lot of the presenters would say, they're going to go over to such and such a room afterward. And you could kind of, not only the guy next to you who's in the same position as you in terms of needing the solution, but also the guy who actually wrote it is there to chat with, there's definitely value. Yeah, that's a good point. That's very valuable.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks. I am going to wrap up the recording now, and then we'll have just a little bit of unstructured time after that. So thank you everyone for attending this time, and we will look forward to the next one.